Hey, Mark, how's it going?
What's going on? How are you today, Kyle?
Doing well, doing well. Already had a few meetings this morning, and so now just ready to jump into this.
This will be great. I'm looking forward to today. We got Rose Puglisi, the Senate or the House Minority Leader, so the House Republican leader, gave us a great update on the legislative session from her perspective. And today, going to have a really nice treat getting it from Marc Snyder, who also is in the House, and but he's a Democrat, so it'll be interesting to get his perspective today.
Yeah, Mark actually has the distinction of being the first repeat guest on our podcast. He joined us last year to kind of talk about the same topic. But I think we got a few other things besides just the session, maybe to chat with him about.
Yeah, I'm excited to see, hear how the summer's going for him, see what he's up to, and see what his plans are for the future.
Yep, sounds good. Well, you want to go ahead and let him in, and we'll get
Let,
going.
let's bring him in.
As I said, you were there. Let me see.
There you
Am I,
go. We
Yep,
gotcha.
am I
yep.
muted?
We
No,
gotcha. No, you're not muted at all.
we can hear you perfectly. How are you,
You
Representative
know,
Snyder?
you are muted far less than Republicans in the state legislature at this point.
Actually, this year I thought we had a pretty balanced approach to all the big bills were bipartisan.
Hey, I'm looking forward to talking about that. Actually, it was just a joke, and it just seemed
Okay.
appropriate there.
I
What?
never mind jokes at my wonderful colleagues on the other side of the aisle's expense.
Well,
That it is a
some
good
would
lead into
say
one of the topics. So
some would say 19 of them are a joke in and of itself, right? Geez, out of 65, only 19 Republicans. That's kind of a joke.
Let's go with quality over quantity.
Yeah, that could be said in some circumstances, I suppose. It's a good thing.
Yeah, it's not a universal, but I think there is some really good quality leadership in the House. I think Rose did a fabulous job.
Well, we had her on the podcast to talk about things from the Republican perspective, in terms of how the session went. And, I think universally, one of the things that we talked about, and one of the things that I think people universally agree about, and that's that, all in all, there was some expectation that this is going to be a pretty rough session, and it turned out to be fairly mild.
It really did, especially if you think about how the previous session ended with all 19 members of the Republican caucus walking out on the last day. Was sure a night and day difference with this year, where we actually had a very congenial last day, sine die, and I think everybody walked away feeling pretty good that we got some good things accomplished for the people of Colorado.
Yeah, and at least it seemed to me on the big stuff for the session, like you said, there was bipartisan support for that.
Yes, I think that's a really encouraging sign moving forward.
that's good. So, Mark, out of the what from in terms of what bills you introduced, what all got passed, and then from your perspective, again, what were maybe a couple of those big ones? We just kind of want to touch on some of the bill stuff first and then dive into a few other things. But just curious, out of what did you sponsor that got passed, and what were some other good ones?
I don't know how much time you guys have, but and I
We'll
look back.
interrupt when necessary.
I look back on the session, and believe it or not, I introduced 25 bills, and of those, 20 I believe passed and were signed into law. Maybe 21. I'd have to do a more formal count.
Now it's
Uh,
like
Okay,
25 where either you were the House sponsor, or you were the House sponsor for a Senate bill, or
correct.
a bill you introduced as the House sponsor.
so
That
maybe
is
we don't go through all 20 of them.
Just hit the highlights for us.
okay. Well, just briefly, I am a uniform law commissioner, so I always have a few of those, like the Uniform Special Deposits Act, and some others that are really in the weeds, very technical in nature, that probably don't have a lot of curb appeal, but they're important bills for making for the ease of business in Colorado. So I generally run those with Senator Bob Gardner, who is my colleague in the Senate on the Uniform Law Commission. But one of the bills
16 years, by the way, for
Yes.
Senator Gardner on the Uniform Law Commission. He'd been there like his entire time in the House and entire time in the Senate.
Just about, I think. Maybe you're right. 16 years, it would have to be, wouldn't it?
If not, it's close, right?
It is close. But we had one uniform law bill that I'm really proud of. It's the removing unlawful restrictions from land records. So, we have a lot of historically bad covenants and racial restrictions in land records that have been carried through, and they have to be republished every time the property changes hands. And Congress passed a law a couple of years ago that you can't republish those offensive restrictions. So Senator Gardner and I, with our Uniform Law Commissioner colleagues, came up with a process by affidavit where we don't have to republish those restrictions. Trying to remove those from 100 years or more of land records, you can imagine, is near impossible. So we found a way going forward that those things won't have to be republished every time. And I think that's, even though those are already have been illegal and unconscionable, unlawful since the 1950s, it's still, and we had a case here in Colorado Springs, a young couple of color were excited. They're buying one of the last affordable homes in the region, and they get their title report and they have to read all of these restrictions saying only Caucasians can live here. People of color can live here only if they're working as a domestic servant. So, no young couple should have to deal with that when they're one of the most exciting times of their life. So very proud of that bill. Had another one, minor.
Just real quick, I actually saw that issue once. I worked with this young attorney in the DA's office here, and she and her husband, friends of mine, moved to Denver, and she brought her deed of trust to me, and it had that very restriction in it. It said African-American people couldn't purchase that property. She's like, isn't this just bizarre? This was probably 10 years ago that, in whatever it was, 2013, 2014, this could actually be a restriction on a deed of trust for a property. It was bizarre.
It is. I'm glad we found I think, a very reasonable way, worked with the title companies, land title, and et cetera, to make sure that we found a way to do this. And our own clerk and recorder was very helpful. They went through this process approximately 2 years ago, much more cumbersome and burdensome. They had to actually go find the microfiche records up at the state archives and find it and go through that. This is a much more expedited process to get to the same place.
Wow. Shout out to our buddy Steve Schleicher. Who would have imagined that was going to happen today?
Yeah.
And you were talking about bills, like I said, a lot of bills. Some of the bills that I didn't get passed are I think were some of the most important. So I was on a bill with Representative Ryan Armagost to refelonize the theft of firearms, which to me just seems like one of the most common sense measures we could take. With the great criminal justice reform beginning in 2019 and 2020, we lowered the penalties for a lot of crimes. And we've seen already that there were unintended consequences, and that was one of them. So, you have people that steal firearms. It's one of the biggest things we can do, according to all the gun safety groups, is to eliminate the theft and illegal firearms. And yet this is happening all the time. Roughly half of the firearms that are stolen when a car is stolen, and the firearms are within there. So we were just going to make it a class 6 felony to steal a firearm. But my colleagues in the House Judiciary Committee, they're not about creating new penalties or stiffening penalties for crimes, and ultimately they didn't pass it. They voted that bill down. But that was one I was very disappointed in. I thought there was real value in doing that, because if you think about a 17-year-old kid who steals a car or steals a gun, they may not have the maturity to know that what they're doing is could be a felony. But
Mark?
So many other people, career criminals, people who've been in the justice system, they know the law, and when they find out that they're not going to be penalized for stealing a firearm, they have no incentive not to.
So why isn't it a felony? Is it just because the dollar value of the gun?
That's yes, exactly right. And we did change that last session with the theft of autos because we were highest
Yeah,
in the nation on that.
remember
And we were
that.
looking to do something similar. And unfortunately, we couldn't convince our colleagues in the House Judiciary Committee of the value of doing that. But I know that's one that
You,
Representative Armagost and I have rude together that we couldn't get that bill through. But I intend to bring something like that back should I make it back to the state Senate.
it's amazing to me how some of that stuff comes full circle. I know several years ago when I was in the legislature, sat on the Criminal Justice Commission in the state, there was a push and an effort at that time to get rid of all those, they were labeled as boutique theft crimes. So theft of newspapers had its own charge, theft of firearms, its own charge, theft of cars, whatever. There were all these boutique crimes. And the idea was, hey, let's get rid of that and just base it on value. And I think in the 10 or 12 years since we got rid of those, the boutique crimes are slowly coming back in. But it seems to me, if you steal a firearm and its value is high enough, yep, that is still a felony. Though there are probably few firearms that would rise to the level of a felony based on value. And two, if you're still an offender, right, and you still steal a weapon, that's still a felony in that you're charged with possession of a weapon by a previous offender, which is a felony.
See, Hunter Biden might have a thought or two on that.
Yeah. I'm interested to know though, Mark, obviously Democrats have had a huge push to, remove guns from the streets, and it seems to me, hey, that Judiciary Committee is made up mostly of Democrats, right? So how does it not get through the legislature?
Yeah.
Or through the committee?
It really comes down to their belief, and they've stated this on the record several times, that increasing penalties does not deter crime. And I just fundamentally disagree with them on that. And it's really frustrating. I have to admit, there were times where I truly felt like I was in the movie Cast Away, alone on an island. I can see the Republican island even further in the distance. It seems like I can see the Democratic island, but I often felt like I was alone on that committee at times this year.
I'm guessing some people thought that implementation of that would somehow be discriminatory in some way.
They do, yes. So they would say that, certain minorities have a higher incidence. But, the bottom line is we're talking about stealing a lethal weapon.
Yeah.
That is the scourge of our modern society, are these gun violence deaths. I don't know if you fellows saw the statistics, but over this Father's Day weekend, it's just incredible and horrible how many deaths by gun violence occurred across the country. And I think we have to do all we can, all hands above it. We had, I think, 8 gun violence prevention bills. I sponsored one, which often gets mischaracterized. It just makes the requirements to get a concealed carry permit. It creates a minimum level of training. I have a concealed carry permit. I took the course. Most all of the good instructors out there already exceed these minimums. But like so many things, we have people that are kind of fly-by-night entities. You go to some of the big gun shows like the Tanner and others, there'll be a breakout room and a barker out front saying, hey, come on in here, take a 2-hour online class, and you can walk out certified for a concealed carry permit. And I just felt like we should follow the industry. And I worked with a lot of our local gun dealers and instructors down here to get it right. And so it requires 50 live round fires, 8 hours of training, and a few other measures. But I think the vast majority of folks in that industry agree with us. They don't like the fly-by-night, instructors also. They think they diminish the industry. So they were really supportive in that one. And I had a kind of a mixed vote on some of the other bills. I didn't go for the FSA at the state level. I again voted against the assault weapons ban this year. Didn't catch quite as much grief as I did last year voting against it.
Yeah, I think everybody is surprised that that bill ended up not passing.
Well, even I think our leading legislator in this space, and of course it comes from a horrible personal tragedy, but Senator Tom Sullivan, he had strong misgivings about that bill along the same lines as me. Is it going to be effective? When I look at the proposed gun safety measures, I have kind of a three-part test. One, is it constitutional? And that's often a hard one. You saw what happened just recently. The Supreme Court struck down the bump stock order that President Trump put in. And that was a bill also that we had last year. So you have to check, see if it's constitutional. And then you have to check if it's enforceable. And then you have to check and see, is it really going to reduce gun violence? So that's kind of my own three-part test that I look at. And some bills pass muster and some don't. So I don't know my exact record, but I was probably around 50-50 on the gun bills.
Yeah, and I thought with the bump stock issue, it was less about the banning of the bump stocks and more about that it was done through executive action.
Yes, I haven't read the opinion in detail, but I think Justice Thomas was saying that it didn't quite make it a fully automatic weapon, but it sure got close. It sure gets it close.
Yeah, I think as I read it, or as I read the news about it, it was much more about, hey, we're not saying a legislative solution wouldn't work here. We're just saying it shouldn't have been done through executive action.
You're right, Mark. He did say that it was right for congressional legislation, but yeah, the executive order, which I think both sides, when they've been in the White House, have made a little extra use of the executive order, and I'm glad that the courts are being a stopgap on that, because we have a legislature for a reason. Granted, it's not the most functional place these days, but it is our system. We should follow it.
Yeah, our legislature's functional at all these days. I mean, golly, especially in DC. Come on.
DC, yeah, I can't explain that, but I think in Colorado, I think we have been an effective legislature. So when I look back at this session, people I often use the term the Democratic agenda. And I think, our detractors use it in a negative way. But I look at what the Democratic agenda has accomplished. And, from everything in education and eliminating for the first time in some 14 years the BS factor, offering 2 years of free community or state college for kids, that because we see kids coming out with so much debt. We've done, I think, a lot of great things in K-12 education, much more. We've really enhanced concurrent enrollment so kids can begin working toward a college degree while they're in high school. We've really expanded apprenticeship programs. I think we've done a lot of good work in higher ed and K-12 this year.
Yeah, I thought when you said you're eliminating the BS factor, you were getting rid of all the bullshit from the legislature, which is impossible. But no,
yeah, I was going to say,
the
to
Bachelor
get into that in
of
1 year
Science
would
factor.
be astounding.
BS,
So,
of course, stands for budget stabilization factor.
Oh, there you go.
hey, Mark, one of the things, so it kind of came up with kind of the way Mark asked one of those questions or brought it up. I think, at least from my standpoint, for Democrats to say something they really wanted didn't get passed does seem surprising with the significant majorities in both houses, in the House and the Senate. So is that partly due to, do you guys actively have conversations about maybe this is overreaching, or is it more pressure from outside that's like, hey, you guys need to reel it back in a little bit? How does that work with those significant majorities like that?
I think it's a little bit of everything you mentioned, but you may recall last summer we had a little lawsuit that basically took away the committee caucus meetings that we used to have. And that's where we would really drill down on policy, on the bill itself. And and find out what objections people may have. We don't have that communication level anymore. So this year, what was really strikingly different from my first 5 sessions was that many times you don't know the vote until the final vote, which I think some people think is the way it should be. Certainly, it shouldn't be all deals made in back rooms. But at the same time, I think we're still working on a process here, because I would use those caucus meetings. Say there was a bill, maybe a Republican or a Democrat or one of each co-sponsoring, co-prime sponsoring that bill. I could talk to the committee members, find out where they were, what objections they had, and I could go back to those sponsors saying, look, if we vote on your bill as is today, it's likely not to pass. If you can address issue A and issue B, we can reschedule it for a couple of weeks. Why don't you get working on that? So I thought it really could be a helpful process. I know it's perceived by a lot of people as being kind of smoke-filled backroom dealing, but at least since I've been chair of the finance committee, it's never been that way.
It's interesting you bring that up. I sort of wonder, as we were talking about, this was much more of a muted session than perhaps last session, and there were better, I don't want to say better legislative outcomes, but from my perspective as a Republican, it seemed like a better session this year than in years past. Certainly a lot better than I was expecting it to be. And, I hadn't thought about how the banning of the Monday morning caucus meeting might have an impact on, how that Democratic caucus, being the majority caucus, was able to move forward. So if they're less on the same sheet of music, if there's more disruption within the caucus, then maybe for Republicans that creates better outcomes. And I think, Kyle, the thing that Mark was talking about here was that and this is tradition that goes back. It's not just something the Democrats did. We as Republicans did it when we were in the majority. We'd get together on Monday mornings and have a meeting and kind of go through all of the legislative agenda for the week, everything that's going to be on the calendar, talk through it, tell the committee chairs what we thought they needed to be doing, members, just make sure everybody's kind of on the same sheet of music. Now, the lawsuit he's talking about actually came out of his caucus. There are members of the Democrats said, hey, we shouldn't be doing this, which I've always, if you actually read the rule, technically, the minority party can do it and do it legally according to the way the statutes and the Constitution's written, because it says, where a majority of the body meets, the legislative body meets, that meeting has to be noticed and there has to be access to, reporters or members of the public, whoever wants to show up. So
and minutes kept. Yes.
And minutes kept. Yeah. And so by definition, the majority party is a majority of the body. So the overall legislative body, 65 members, you get 33 of them in a room, that's a majority. So that Monday morning meeting for the majority party is by definition a majority of the body meeting, and all those things need to happen. However, if you're the minority party, right, and there are only 19 of you, you can meet all day long because you're not a majority of the legislative overall body. So anyway, having said all of that, I wonder, maybe that did have an impact on the outcome of the session.
I think it did. And just to clarify a little bit, the Republican caucus was sued also.
Yeah, I get it. I get that they were sued. I get that everybody was sued. But I think, as I read it, as Mark the attorney reads it, the minority party can legally engage in those kind of meetings. Now, maybe the court said, nope, you shouldn't engage in that kind of activity. But as I read the statutes, it seems to me that that was a loophole for the minority party to be able to meet.
I think that's a good read, but I think the consent decree that we ultimately signed off on applied to both parties.
Sure.
And, and I think, which is probably the right outcome. I was always felt a little uneasy about the way we conducted business in light of the open meeting laws and the sunshine laws of Colorado, which are very, very vigorous. So
and necessary, right? We want the public to be a part of the process.
Yes.
But I think, what it did, probably an unintended consequence, is it gave the lobby more power and more influence than they'd had in the past. So if legislators can't really talk to each other about upcoming bills, you need some communication. And what happens, the lobbyists are all too happy to fill that void. So I don't know if that was ever the intention of the bill, but I think the lobby had more influence on the outcome of bills this year than they have in the previous years.
That's a whole nother issue to talk about, but I think term limits have made the staffers in the lobby corps so much more powerful than legislators because they're the institutional knowledge now.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well said.
Yep.
So how about some of the big bills? Or I'm sorry, Kyle, what were you going to say?
That's what I was going to ask. Go ahead.
Well, for better or worse, I'm kind of a numbers wonk. Probably why I was named chair of the House Finance Committee. And so I ran a bill back in the special session last November, creating the Property Tax Task Force. And they met right up and came up with their final report around March 15th. And it was a very balanced group. I believe there were more Republican legislators than Democratic legislators on that task force. But we brought together county officials, the property tax assessors, all the people that needed to be at the table. And they came up with some good recommendations. And then we built legislation upon those recommendations. I think it was a good bill. It was a lot of compromise in there. We capped valuation increases at 5.5%, which some people feel didn't go far enough. But at the same time, I think we have to recognize we're in a very inflationary, as well as property prices are just going through the roof right now because we haven't kept up with demand. And it's a very simple supply and demand issue. So I thought capping that, we created an additional valuation deduction exemption up to $70,000, basically 10% of your home's value, but it caps at 70,000. So if you're above 700,000, it's probably not as big an issue for you as, say, as seniors on fixed income that have owned their home for 40 years. But there was a lot of good bipartisan stuff in that bill. And even we looked at Tabor refunds, which, we'd always done the 6-tier system up until the pandemic. I believe 2021 was the first time we did a check back to everybody. But that one I was very impressed with. It put a lot of guardrails on how and when we issue Tabor refunds. And for the first time, included an income tax reduction, which I know is one that Governor Polis and I believe most of the Republicans in the legislature have been calling for since I first got elected. So I think it makes basic theory is why collect all this excess money and have to refund $2.5 billion or whatever the number ends up being every year? How about we don't collect a bunch of that in the first place and leave it in people's pockets and let them decide how to spend their money, what their priorities are. So I thought that was another really good bill, was the Tabor refund reform.
You know what I thought was kind of interesting about that one? Well, first of all, the as you know, that first bill that got introduced, 85-page bill, where there were some folks saying, hey, this is what we think the commission wanted us to do. And it's kind of introduced in the waning days of the session. And all of a sudden everybody was up in arms, nope, this isn't what we wanted, not where we were going. And then the bill that ultimately passed, I think it was introduced in literally the last 3 days of the session, if I remember that correctly, or last 5 days.
Pretty close, 5 days, I think, but yeah. And I've learned that's just the way that the institution works. It's very frustrating because the biggest bills of the year that really need to be properly stakeholdered and discussed and out there for public comment, that's cut off with such a short timeline. The rules are different the last days of session, so things can happen a lot quicker.
So,
but at least, yeah.
So Kyle's a rich guy, and this probably doesn't matter to him, being who he is. Just look at him.
Yeah.
For the average though homeowner, what kind of a break are they going to get on their homeowners taxes? Say, you have, what is the median price of a house in Colorado Springs is now, I think, about $570,000, which is ridiculous. It seems like to me, but how much of a break are you going to be looking at if you own that kind of house?
Well, we've seen valuations increase double digits. Some places it's up, approaching 50% even. So
Yeah,
capping
mine
it,
went up 40%.
yeah. So we were able to give 1 year relief last year during the special session. And I think what we did this year was cap it at 5.5% going into the future. And we've also really tried to target it at the folks that will be most severely impacted by those valuation increases. So we've maintained the senior homestead exemption. We've created a portability aspect to that now. So you no
That's a
longer,
great thing.
yeah, we've been trying to
Love
do
that.
that for years. And I know Senator Liston was always pushing for that. And so have I. I've been looking at this since I got up there. These are challenging issues. But I think we're really trying to target those folks that are on fixed incomes. Say if you're seniors, you're living off Social Security, those kind of increases can be devastating. So we've really tried to target those most at risk, and recognizing that, as people have more wealth accumulation, their homes are worth more, they have higher incomes, they can more properly afford to do that. But I think there's some ballot measures. I'm not sure what's been certified, but one would cap valuation increases at 4%. And unfortunately, with all the good work we did with balancing the school finance formula and the budget stabilization factor, if that were to pass, we're going to be right back in a situation where the state is backfilling special districts and school districts. We're trying to get the state out of that business. When Gallagher first passed in 1982, I believe, roughly the same amount of property tax was collected from residential as from commercial. But because of that rigid formula in the Gallagher amendment, residential rates kept going down, and there you had to make up the shortfall with commercial going up. So with this time, for the first time ever, we actually have a phased in program to lower the commercial assessment. Currently at 29, it'll end at 25.
To me, I thought that was the biggest, best piece of that whole piece of legislation.
I agree. It was. I think overall it was a good package in that.
Yeah, I mean, businesses paying more than 4 times. If you have a $500,000 business property, your taxes are a little bit more than 4 times greater than if you have a $500,000 residence.
And I've watched that continue to get worse and worse and worse. So we have created a cap. I think the residential rate will be 6.85, but it'll be allowed to float back up to its set limit of 7.15. And what we're trying to do, though, is get back to the original intent, I think, of Gallagher and even the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which is to equalize these things. So when Gallagher first was introduced, and Tabor, it was roughly 60% of school budgets came from local property taxes, and the state government filled in the other 40. That has now flipped on its head, and we're trying to get it back to a more reasonable sense. And I think the School Finance Act that reform that passed this year fits in well with that. So we're empowering more local districts to figure out how best to use their resources. And we're trying to have the funding follow the student, not the school district. And I think that's really going to be a game changer, because, it's a great experiment with 173 school districts, or whatever exact number is. We have a lot of areas where districts can try things, see what works. Charter schools, I have to admit, when I first started, I was a little skeptical of charter schools, but I see a real value in them now. Now I'm mainly impressed with the district charter schools. The state charter schools, I think there's some reform needed in that area. But I think, I think we're recognizing that there's a lot of different ways kids can learn, and we need to be trying those different avenues and seeing what works. And when we find a good one, we should work toward promoting it.
Good. That's great.
So, yeah, I think we could sit here and talk about legislation all day. I think, again, at the end of the day, this is how I've sort of summed up this legislative session. If you said to me, hey, you can, at the beginning of the session, if you said, hey, you can have the outcome that we ended up with, or you can pick what's behind door number 2. I think I would, as a Republican, I would take the outcome that we ended up with all day long. I thought overall a pretty decent and fair session. You know, there were times I was happy and times I was pissed off, but that's usually the sign of the right kind of things happening. But I think we want to, like, you know, kind of talk about, so how does this, what does this look like moving forward? I mean, I can't help but notice that you just so happen to accidentally have in the background there, Marc Snyder for State Senate.
Is that up there?
Oh yeah, I just, it's, you know, who knew that was going to be there? But in you know, you're running for a seat that does not currently sit within a Democrat's hands, right? And we're going to have you on to talk about that race at a later date after the primary is over, because we know it's going to be a very contentious race. But the thing that we're wondering about here is, as these legislative majorities grow, and especially for a guy like you that is, you know, all intents and purposes, you know, don't like to put labels on people, but you're a moderate Democrat.
Yes, sir.
Right? Very much a moderate, you know, maybe just slightly left-leaning from the middle. So how is it, you know, we talked a little bit about it with your colleagues, but how is it working through the legislature, you know, when you have such significant Democratic majorities? Does that make it harder for a guy like you to legislate? Or are you happy about that? I mean, how do you want to see, what do you want the legislature to look like in the coming years as we move forward?
Well, I think you've really hit on an important point, because when I first got elected in 2018, that was the first time Democrats had the trifecta, the Senate, the House, and the governor's office in some time. And so I knew there were going to be a lot of, I don't want to say progressive, for lack of a better term, bills that have been held up for years in the state Senate coming through. But the change I've seen in the 6 years is we now have a much more to the left caucus within the Democrats. And so I think for a lot of centrists like myself, we're finding ourselves kind of in the middle. And I think it's appealing to more of my caucus. You know, we have both caucuses have their extreme members that really are far right or far left. But I think what I found this year, I really applaud leadership of the House and the Senate and the governor's office for negotiating some really important compromises. So the compromise with oil and gas, I think it was a really good one. I have a great mentor in my life, is a woman named Marcy Morrison, who I'm sure you know, and I learned an awful lot from her. And as she said, you know, a good compromise can either be everybody is mostly satisfied or everybody's mostly unsatisfied. And I think we see a little bit of both of those here. I know some of the environmental groups weren't totally excited about the oil and gas deal that was program that was rolled out, and probably oil and gas didn't get everything they wanted either. Same with the caps on malpractice, the trial lawyers. You know, they weren't exactly happy. You know, they were, I'm sure, rather had no cap at all. But we had a lot of other groups, insurers, and the ones who have to pay out some of these judgments. They wanted to keep the caps down artificially low. So I think finding that middle ground, I think that's the future for Colorado. I've never met a political philosophy yet that pays for a new backhoe or enhances a police officer's salary. So it's okay when in the campaign season to have all of your political theories and what have you, but when it's time to govern, politics is more of a hindrance than a help.
Boy, it's spoken like Ronald Reagan there, huh?
Well, it was unintentional, but I'll take it.
So, Mark, you're looking at running for the Senate. You are running for the Senate.
Yes, sir.
What do you see in terms of, if you get elected and make that switch, what are the differences that you you encounter in that situation? I mean, I know the Senate's smaller, so each individual person might have a little bit bigger impact, but what do you see as kind of some of the biggest differences if you move to the other side of the legislature?
Well, I think you hit on the biggest difference. One, I think having served 6 terms in the House now, or 6 sessions in the House, I know a heck of a lot more than I knew 6 years ago. And I'd like to be able to bring all of that to bear, and if I do get elected to the state Senate. And you're right, the margins are much closer in committees. So like the House Judiciary Committee was an 8-3 committee, 8 Democrats, 3 Republicans. I got to convince an awful lot of my caucus colleagues to vote with me in order to get a meaningful change. And that didn't happen very often, if at all. Whereas in the Senate, many committees are 3-2 or 5-4, let's say, and you really have a lot more ability to shape legislation. So much of what goes on at the Capitol never really gets publicized. So I was chair of the Finance Committee, and we had, I believe, if I could get any 3 Democrats to oppose a bill, and if Republicans held strong, that bill would die in committee. And with that ability, I was able to talk to the bill sponsors and the stakeholders and tell them, here are the issues that I see. These are the things that give me heartburn with this bill. Here's a way to fix that. So in finance, it's often about the funding source. So there was a bill that it was a justice bill. It was a lot trying to provide more representation for low-income folks in civil matters. So we have Colorado Office of Legal Services. They do a fine job, but they only can take on about one, and I've heard different numbers, but about 1/3 of the people that could use some help there. So the bill came forward, and the funding source was to hit county court fees and district court fees, increase those, and use that money to provide legal representation. Well, I realized quickly at county court, that's where most of your low income people claims are heard, because district court is a $25,000 minimum. So I was able to change that, so to reduce the fee in county court, raise the fee a little bit in district court, still provide roughly the same amount of money for that type of work. But there were other parts of that. So they had a part of that bill would have moved the liability across the table. So even if the plaintiff wins a judgment and they would get those court costs awarded, they were trying to prohibit them from collecting that. I was able to remove that restriction. And that was a bill that you'll never see my name on that bill, but I probably put as much time into that as some of my own bills. So there's countless examples where you can make a bill. I agree with a lot of my colleagues about the aspirations and the intent of what they want to do. What I disagree with them is how we're going to accomplish that. I mean, if we do things that destroys an industry or tanks our economy, nobody benefits from that. And in fact, the same people that they're trying to help, people of lesser means, are the most impacted by those types of events. So I constantly am trying to get them to understand that, we need to keep a healthy economy. We can make it more equitable. We can address some of the past injustices, but we have to do that in a way that keeps Colorado prosperous and moving forward.
Well, I actually think you're the guy you're trying to replace summed it up best when he was describing the difference between the House and the Senate, when he said half as many people, but twice as many assholes. So just understand that's what you're getting yourself into here. So
I'm still trying to master my Bob Gardnerisms.
Yeah, you're going to have, if you win the seat, you've got big shoes to fill that way. But I think it sort of begs the question, though. The Democrats may grow by a seat in the Senate this year. Not sure that the House is really going to have much of a change. Maybe Republicans haven't picked up a seat in the House since 2010. Maybe there's a seat or two there. So what is that? Does that make it harder for guys like you to legislate when it's so out of skew? Or in your mind, does it make it easier when your party has such massive control?
I do think it's harder. It is harder because, if there's a bill that I really have problems with, I'm not going to be able to vote for it as it currently is. Back in 2018, when we had 41 seats, if I could find a way to flip nine voters, nine legislators, we could make a seriously effective change, either to the bill or in some cases, if the sponsors aren't willing to be reasonable, kill it outright. That's just gotten so far out of reach right now. Although I will tell you, last session, I mentioned when the Republicans walked out, and that was it 213, the big land use bill that ended up morphing into HH and was resoundingly defeated at the ballot. I counted 18 Democrats who were willing to vote against that on the last day of the session. And had the Republicans stuck with us and stayed on the floor, that very well may have been defeated, and we never would have had HH on the ballot. We would have had a special session, which we ended up having anyway. But so I do think there's a new pivot towards governing from the center. I think a lot of the really progressives had bills last year that didn't make it to the finish line. Some of them are much better legislators now. I've always felt if you get 70, 75, 80% of what you want in the bill, you should declare that a victory. That's a success. And I think a lot of them come in thinking it's 100% or nothing, and they need to have a couple of nothings before they start to realize that there's a better way to legislate.
Yeah. Good. Hey, so we're about out of time. I really want to thank you for joining us again for your second visit on our podcast. You are our most frequent guest after 9 episodes. And like Mark said, I know we want to have you back as we get closer to November in that Senate race, just to hear from both of you, whoever you're going to be up against, and just to get a feel for kind of positioning in that race for some of the voters to listen to. But really do appreciate you being able to take the time today and joining us. And we always love talking to you. And so thank you.
And
well, right back at you.
Well, appreciate it. But hey, if you could do us a little bit of favor, we're trying to grow an audience here. We're trying to make this a bigger, badder deal. So we try to get all of our guests to say something controversial. Is there anything controversial you might say for us now that, is going to help us grow our listenership and viewership? Because it's, at the end of the day, it's really a lot less about you and how well you're doing for the people of the state of Colorado.
I love the look on Mark's
and more
face.
About Kyle and I.
What am I walking into here?
A lifetime of avoiding controversy. That's going to be a sea change for me to come up with something controversial. The one thing I've worked for with governor's office was extending the hours on alcohol establishments, and that is one universally unpopular idea in Colorado with Mothers Against Drunk Driving and fellow legislators. So I would say that would be my one. Would get anything. We should let bars stay open 24 hours a day.
Oh, there you go. Well, I was only kidding, but thank you for that. Appreciate it. So
that's great. Take care, Mark. Appreciate seeing you.
Thanks, fellas. Really appreciate you too.
Look forward to talking to you after the primary.
Look, me too. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right.
Yeah, that was good. He's always interesting to talk to about what's been happening up in Denver, and I always like his perspective on things.
I think he's one of those guys that, and he kind of alluded to it as he was talking. You may not agree with how he's going to do it or what his solution is, but he certainly wants the best outcomes for the people of the state of Colorado. He's not in it for some personal agenda. And that's something I've always appreciated about Mark. We might disagree on how you do things, and how you get from A to B. But I think that he has always been the guy that truly wants to do the right thing. And
Yeah.
I think, for anybody, that's a great starting point, right?
Yeah, that's true. I think I've known him now for probably 15 years or so. And that's always been my take, that he's one of the people that his heart's in the right place. And so, yeah, it'll be interesting to see that race in November. I mean, like you said, that's a seat that could flip. And, he's proven, he can get elected in this county. So that's going to be a good one to watch.
Well, and maybe what it comes down to is maybe there are opportunities for people in the middle. It seems like we've gone to such extremes on both sides, and that's how you get elected. You get elected by saying the most controversial thing, and you get elected by going as, pandering as far to your base as you can, whether it's to the right or the left. And those are the kind of personalities that end up getting votes today. Maybe he's the kind of guy that proves, hey, if you're a little bit more in the middle, you can still get elected, and hopefully then create good policy. Because
Yeah.
I'm telling you, man, it doesn't happen from the far right or the far left.
Exactly. I think you're exactly right. So for this week, what anything pissing you off this week?
Boy, we have hit on it already and talked about it a little bit today. It just sort of kills me. And talking about, not being able to get anything done in the legislative body. And so we have, it always sort of kills me. Republicans in control of the White House. Donald Trump is there. All the Democrats are pissed off about the way that he governs through executive order as opposed to doing it through the legislative process. And then, Biden's in control, Democrats are there, all the Republicans are pissed off because he is legislating through executive order. By the way, I effing hate how much we use executive order to govern, not just at the federal level. I mean, that also has happened at the state quite a bit. It happened through COVID. I got very irritated with the governor as he was legislating through executive action during COVID. But here's what really kills me about this. Legislatures fail to act, forces the executive into having to legislate through executive order, and then we get mad at the executive. The legislature gets mad at the executive for legislative through executive order. You know what, people? Step up and do your effing jobs. You get paid to create policy. Do it. This isn't about just complaining about what the other side's doing in an effort to get more people from your side elected. You get there, actually govern. Kills me, Kyle. We've seen it. The bump stock issue.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, is probably something I don't, as a legislator, I would not have supported banning bump stocks. But that's an example of an executive action, calling on Biden to, this one's the one that kills me, calling on Biden to hey, we got a bipartisan deal on the border, right? But we're not going to do the bipartisan deal on the border because we don't want to give you a victory. You need to do that through executive action.
Yep.
So we can complain about what you're doing through executive action, even though we should be able to do this legislatively.
Yeah. But that's where we are with the divisiveness. That's what it's brought about. And again, it'll be interesting to see what, if anything, can force that to change or help that to change in the near term. I don't see it happening, but even in the long term, what's it going to take to get back to at least some semblance of how the House and the Senate used to operate and get at least a little more done?
Yeah, and I think what it comes down to, and it's easy to say we need more Marc Snyders of the world, but he has the luxury of doing that, right? I mean, because he's sitting in a district that is pretty evenly matched. Our old minority leader in the state house, Mike May, used to say, vote your district or somebody else will.
Yeah.
and Mark certainly, you know, as a moderate, represents the district. I've always maintained, and I think one of the biggest problems is, yeah, I think that we've become more polarized as a nation, and people tend to live in areas that are polarized. So, like, if you're a, you know, Republican, you tend to live with other Republicans. If you're a Democrat, you tend to live with other Democrats. But I've always said this: the way that we have gerrymandered all of these seats across America, you know, not only at the federal level, but at the state level, that's really what's produced the poor outcomes. Because
Yeah.
when you have, you know, all of these races that are settled in the primaries, that's when you tend to get the extreme left and the extreme right.
Yeah. And hopefully, as we go on, we're going to be able to get into some episodes on specific issues. And that's actually something that I'd love to dig a little deeper into, is gerrymandering and looking at how some of the states are trying to change that, or at least moderate the process a little bit, so that there might be some more competitive seats. But that's something I'd love to get into in more detail.
Yeah, I mean, we put that commission in place in Colorado a couple of years ago. God, I feel like the evil empire has come down here. Like the lighting in my room has changed, and I look like, you know, I don't know, some like ominous figure coming forward here. But yeah, I agree with you. I think that that is a major issue, something I love to talk about. We tried to fix it in Colorado a little bit, didn't do a real great job there. Tried to make the process a little less political. I don't think we've been overly successful that way. And, you know, it's problem is when you have political people creating the process, whether they're trying to create a non-political process or not, it ends up being political. And it creates problems. And that's one of the things that I believe if we could get away from, we would end up with better outcomes.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you for another fun episode, and look forward. I think next up we've got some
State
candidates.
legislative race, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Trying to
Yeah.
cover one of those. Or actually, I think that episode will end up airing before this episode does. So
yeah, so we can sneak it in before the primary. But then after that one, and after we get past the primary, I mean, I'm sure right after the primary, we're going to want to dissect some of that and see how that went, whether it's the congressional CD5 race or some of these local county commission and house races, and just kind of dive in and see if there's any surprises from our county here.
So is this episode going to air before the primary happens? I think it will, right?
One day, probably.
I'm calling it right here. Crank 60, Williams 40, and CD5.
Okay, I'll go. Not that it's going to make things all that controversial or whatever, but I'm not going to pick Williams just so we have something to talk about here. But I think it'll be a little bit closer. I'll go 56-44.
Yeah, I think as one of my old friends would say, you know, about a guy like Williams, I don't know if he's Melba, French, or white, but he's going to be toast.
That's great. Hey, thanks a lot, Mark. I appreciate it.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.